My hot take is that we all are going to take for granted talking to LLMs with our voice at some point in the future, way more than even the most optimistic of us think, because it's one of those see around the corner things. Like, you just can't quite imagine it. It's a little like when the iPhone came out. Can you quite imagine the sort of social, local, mobile stuff that happened 3-4 years later? A few months after GPT-4 came out and we started publishing these open source libraries, I just saw huge numbers of individual young developers in San Francisco building themselves personal coaches and, therapists and assistants. And that early adopter, like, oh, I'm just going to build it for myself thing resonated so powerfully with people who were like, had access to these tools. I think we're all going to have friends in our group chats that aren't human because LLMs are actually really entertaining. So like, I'm in a bunch of group chats, and those group chats are all going to have LLMs in them. There's no question about it.
Hey everybody, welcome to Smart Speakers. Today we are speaking with Kwindla Hultman Kramer, the co-founder and CEO of Daily and the creator and maintainer of PipeCat, an amazing open source toolkit for building voice agents, a toolkit I use, by the way. Quinn shares its excitement about how building on the internet in 2025 right now feels just like it did back in 1995, which I also feel. It's back when folks like us were dialing into BBSs to play door games late at night. We also talk about his experience with evolutionary algorithms that broke all the rules in super weird ways, about AI companions joining your group chats, and why your next FaceTime call might be with a non-human friend. Plus, we go deep into the technical challenges and opportunities building real-time agents with LLMs, and how Quinn's decades-long career has brought him to this point, building Daily and PipeCat. So I truly, truly enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure you will too. Let's get started. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled you guys are doing this. I watched the first couple episodes, or the first two that I saw released, and it's awesome.
Awesome. Appreciate that. You're one of very few but very smart listeners in addition to the smart speakers. Appreciate you joining us. We always ask as a first question, like, what your first aha moment was from AI, because we've had some amazing answers so far. Would really be curious to hear about you.
So I'm old. I went to grad school a long time ago, and I actually had a couple of like aha moments back then before I fell down a different rabbit hole. I built a lot of hardware in graduate school, and there was a paper that was published in the late 90s about evolutionary algorithms running on FPGAs. And the mind-blowing result of that paper was that there were abnormal circuits that the GAs had found, exploiting like capacitance across small blocks in the FPGA that you would never program if you were writing code for the FPGA. And I read that paper and I was like, there's like a whole different toolkit here that's really interesting. And I wrote some like very bad genetic algorithms code to play Go. You could actually play Go using the little creatures that my genetic algorithms programs created. And then I fell down a totally different rabbit hole and started working for the next 20 years on like very large scale, very low latency network systems. And that became the thing that I just loved doing day in and day out. And then GPT-4 came out, and GPT-4 was, 20 years later, the next kind of mind-blowing thing that kind of connected all those dots for me. And so over the last couple of years, I've worked, most of my time actually has gone into blending what you can do with these new conversationally capable LLMs and all the associated models and tooling that we put around them now to build on top of our, global low latency network infrastructure to let you talk to LLMs with your voice.
That's super cool. It sounds like you're able to connect the dots in a really kind of like indirect path. So the FPGA is just, I'm trying to remember. So these are programmable chips that are kind of like not really in fashion anymore, but I sort of remember at the time it was a huge area of interest. And what you're saying is there are evolutionary algorithms that were programming the FPGAs to behave in ways that humans just simply wouldn't have thought of, or like wouldn't have used the sort of like tricks that that the algorithms ended up exploiting. That is crazy.
At the hardware level, which is why
AlphaGo moment where like, the AlphaGo player, I forget his name, but just like had to like get up and leave the room when AlphaGo made some crazy move that no human would ever make. Is this a similar thing, just kind of going outside the bounds of human expectation?
Yeah, I think so. To me personally, though, even more mind-blowing, because I don't think it was super shocking to me, and maybe this is just because I don't know enough about Go, that there would be sort of out of the game frame strategies. But to actually go down below the level of the programmable hardware elements and
That's
exploit
crazy.
like quantum phenomena or whatever it is when you're, exploiting like little bits of capacitance between the hardware modules, uh, that seems like almost even another category of kind of things the system learns that you didn't expect it to learn.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Would love to kind of like back up a little bit. So you talked about that 20-year journey. How did you get into tech to begin with? You got started by designing tools to help kids learn coding. Is that how you kind of like took the leap?
Yeah, so I went to grad school at the MIT Media Lab, and we had free reign to build all kinds of fun and interesting experimental things, which was really amazing. And my advisor was Mitchell Resnick, who runs a group called Lifelong Kindergarten, and his whole world is building amazing educational tools, both software and hardware, of all sorts of different kinds. So I built a bunch of tools with Mitchell's influence and other collaborators to give kids kind of new programming languages. And the tools that kind of I loved the most that I worked on were these little tiny pieces of hardware that you could like write code for, and then you could upload the code to these little tiny pieces of hardware. And so uh, I built even smaller bits of hardware than other people in our lab had been building, and lots of them, so that they communicated to each other by sending little bits of code around. So they were network programmable little societies of interacting uh, tiny robots that talked by sending code to each other, and they would execute the code they sent around, and then the code could be modified in various ways. So that was sort of a programming environment that I thought was really fun to kind of think about the ramifications of. But it also was just adjacent to building new kinds of programmable networks for enterprise. And I had lots of friends in grad school who were building kind of new network things. And I kind of slowly gravitated towards the more enterprisey use cases of these programmable large scale networks and away from the educational use cases, but always sort of in the back of my mind, these little robots that talk to each other by sending code around.
That's, I mean, yeah, I guess that's what we're all sort of manipulating at the end of the day still. How did you end up exploring the enterprise side of it?
Well, the internet was so new then, and just thinking about what it meant to hook lots and lots and lots of computers up together was new, and that we've sort of forgotten that now because we've spent a fair amount of time learning all those lessons, and applying those lessons to things like, oh, what happens if you build out really big clouds commercially? What happens if you put a phone that has more processing power than any computer I had up until like 1998 or whatever in everybody's pocket? um, and so we've really expanded sort of the scope of how we think about that stuff. But in the late 90s, just the fact that you could connect very large numbers of computers together at all was so new. And that seemed to me like it motivated asking a bunch of questions about like what a network actually is. Like when you connect two computers together with a wire, what is it you're actually doing? This was still the days when like we were arguing on the industry side of things, we were still arguing about packet versus circuit switched, and
Yeah.
were packet switched networks ever going to scale to be really useful? And all the old school telephone company networking heads were like, yeah, I mean, you guys with your packet switch toys, if you really want reliability, you got to connect things with a circuit. So I mean, it was a time when I think just exploring what networks actually could do and what the architectures for enabling networks um, might look like was like new, and that was really exciting.
That's super fun. I feel like for me, my early exposure to like a very tiny version of that was just like the BBS world
Yes.
of, dialing up. Well, I mean, I feel bad for my parents who had to pay these bills before I figured out the different like toll prefixes or whatever. But calling up computer to computer, leaving messages, playing games, downloading files, and then there was an evolution. I ran a couple of boards out of our basement and messaging networks where at night computers would dial each other, the nodes would dial each other and like exchange like messages on shared boards, which was like such a cool thing. And I totally messed up the configuration and had people calling my parents' house for years and years at night as part of some like FidoNet thing. But it was so fun and kind of like not an AI aha moment, but certainly an aha moment for me. Like, whoa, this is crazy. It's just like And we've sort of lost like that fundamental joy of just like, hey, these two computers are talking to each other, or these four computers are talking to each other. That's amazing. Like, we take that for granted now because every device is on the internet. My light bulbs are on the internet. But it is still an amazing thing.
It was a straight line for me from the BBS systems with door games and limited number of lines, and you dialed until you didn't get a busy signal anymore, to the early internet, to what a network architectures look like once you're really at internet scale, to we have enough network throughput and processing power to do real-time audio and video. And if you can
Yeah.
do real-time audio and video, what does that open up? So that was sort of my personal like trajectory, if you oversimplify. And I've been thinking a lot again about that kind of BBS to internet period and how exciting it was, because this moment in generative AI is the first time that's felt quite like that to me again. I
Yeah,
mean, I've been
same.
incredibly lucky to be in tech and be a programmer and have made a career doing this stuff, and I've loved every phase of it. But 1995 to 1999 felt a certain way, and it never felt that way quite again. And maybe it
Yeah.
should have, but it never did until 2023 to 2025.
Yeah.
And it's still going, thankfully,
Yeah.
for now.
Totally. But I've been thinking about an old BBS door game that I got super addicted to called Trade Wars 2002.
Oh,
I
yeah,
know
love
Trade
Trade
Wars.
Wars.
Yeah.
On your system. And so I wrote a bunch of client code for Trade Wars because you had a certain number of turns you could use, and you really needed to use those turns effectively. So I wrote, exploration clients and all that stuff. And I've been thinking about what a Trade Wars like game would look like if you made your ship computer an LLM.
That's super interesting.
That's super interesting. I
We should
I
build them.
made iPhone games in the very early days of the iPhone, and one of my like sources of inspiration back when I suck at graphics and stuff, but I could like make iPhone games in the early days because they all sucked. So mine was not unusual. I like looked to doors for inspiration, right? Because games like Barren Realms Elite and Usurper and all these stuff, they were really cool, kind of like turn based things that like had a really good daily interaction. Way before Duolingo had streaks, I was logging into these different BBSs every day so I could get my turns. If you didn't, you would lose your place on the leaderboard. So you sounds like you scripted that up. You were like one step ahead of the rest of us that were actually dialing in.
I've been thinking about Trade Wars 2002, and I've been thinking about Lambda Moo, and what would those two games look like if you replaced a big chunk of the core tech stack with LLMs? Because I think the mechanics were so good, and
Mechanics were great.
they were so interactive in a way that even I think a lot of contemporary games that are great are not quite as immersive in a psychological sense, even though the graphics and everything else is better. But if you went back to some of those lessons from those early games, as you were saying, and put an LLM in the middle of them, I think you could do some amazing
There's
things.
something there. There's
Yeah,
something
for
there. 'Cause
sure.
those games really had a hold on a lot of people, and it was a magic time because that was so new to play these games with other people. But magic is back. So
Yeah.
like, why not give it a try, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure we're all busy doing other things, but perhaps in our copious spare time, we can collab on something here, or ask Cloud Code to write something for us.
We need Stuart Butterfield to come back and do a third.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he needs to do something, and then
Yeah, and he'll
accidentally,
have an
yeah.
accidental billion-dollar startup again. For me, some of the pattern matches, it felt very subversive in those days. To like engage in PBSs and like be in that culture. And I think it's happening again. Like I'm watching my kids, my 10-year-old and his friends engage with LLMs, and it feels like another moment where they're able to do stuff without asking permission from me that is like super creative, super fun, super engaging for them, and they can just like go and do it. And it's like their playground, which is so fun.
To bring it back around to voice, my 10-year-old, uh, for a variety of path-dependent reasons, mostly uses Claude. Uh, and Claude doesn't have a full voice mode, but still his default approach is to hit the talk to it button, ask it a question, and then have it, then read the answer. And I think it's super interesting to watch, kids who are, under 15 or whatever, and how
Yeah,
they
that's their
actually use the
default.
technology, because it feels like they are the future. They're doing stuff before the rest of us do that shows what it's really going to be like.
Yeah, totally. I wanna get back onto the uh, career path a little bit. Primarily because I think it's fascinating when you look at your resume and you see CTO of all Africa. Would love to hear that story. Would love to hear how you got there from where you were, at MIT, exploring network infrastructure, and then taking that position.
So my parents are journalists. They've always done Africa stuff. Their work to me is an inspiration. I mean, they've spent their lives connecting people through journalism and working closely with colleagues all over Africa on a huge variety of really interesting journalism projects. Um, they were early to the internet. They worked with a bunch of their friends in various news organizations around the African continent to kind of get content up on the early BBSs and AOL and and professional wire services that did electronic distribution. So when the web came along, they built some web stuff just because they already had all this digital content, and then they got a whole bunch of interest from uh, NGO partners and government partners and venture capitalists to sort of figure out how to scale that up. So I was like, oh, I know how to do a piece of this. I'm going to take 6 months away from grad school and I'm going to help them get All Africa, the sort of web side started, and then I'll go back to grad school. And I never went back to grad school. We built a big sort of content management system before content management systems were a thing. We open sourced all that stuff. That was all Perl code, which dates it, to a certain period. And that whole technology stack was then used by lots and lots of other people because it was open source. It was used by lots of people in Washington D.C. in the political world. That tech stack was used by the John Kerry campaign, and so there was this whole sort of thing I kept getting pulled into. But then I managed after a few years to kind of go back to the stuff that was more my core kind of low level tech interest when a friend from grad school called me and said, that stuff I worked on in grad school, it's going to be in the movie Minority Report. And people who've seen early clips are already asking how they buy it. So maybe there's a company here. So I moved out to LA to join my friend John from the Media Lab, who was the guy who did those gestural interfaces in Minority Report. And we started a company to build a new operating system because we thought a multi-user, multi-screen, multi-device operating system was an interesting project to work on. It started as a kind of science fair project with a really fantastic demo reel made by Steven Spielberg, which was not a bad thing for
Yeah.
a startup.
Pretty good for the
And
pipeline. Yeah.
it was pretty good for the pipeline. But we were definitely engineers trying to, back our way into figuring out what a product and what a market and what a go-to-market looked like. So we figured that out over several years. We grew, from a few to 120 people and to $20 million in annual revenues. But definitely were a little bit stuck at the high end of the market. Like we sold to Fortune 50 companies, and we never figured out a way to sort of go from $1 million average contract value to something much more mass market. But I was really proud of the tech work, and I thought, when the Vision Pro came out last year, it was sort of the first time I thought anybody else had gotten a bunch of the pieces we put together into a form factor that was more democratized. And I was like a huge fan of the Vision Pro for that reason. After 8 years, there was, an exit for me, and I spent a couple years kind of thinking about whether I wanted to do another startup because startups are like not easy usually.
Hmm.
Um,
I've heard they're really easy personally. That's what I read about it. So
you have to give me some tips then. So I felt like, I had all these lessons I'd learned, and I really still love to write code, and I still love to write sort of the network and audio video code. And I thought, there's going to be an inflection point here where real time audio and video are a big thing on the internet, are like a huge use case. How could we build something that made that world accessible to sort of every developer? And there was a moment where I thought we were going to have enough compute and enough network bandwidth. And there was a new standard called WebRTC that was starting to get built into web browsers. And, the adoption of a new standard is often, part of a catalyzing event. And then I thought there were all these use cases that were just, to me, super obvious. It turned out they weren't super obvious because I built a bunch of prototypes, I built a bunch of network stack stuff, and then used going through YC as a forcing function for actually starting a company. I was like, okay, I will apply to YC, and if if that happens, great. I'll actually have to do this as a company. So we did. But then coming out of YC, we raised a seed round as you typically do, and I pitched, I think, mostly VCs I'd known for a while. So like I was a known quantity to them. And still, I think something like 10 out of the 12 VCs we pitched in 2016 about like ubiquitous audio and video on the internet were like, yeah, I just don't think that many people are going to do video calls. Okay. Good. You should not invest in this company. But I'm really, really stubborn. So that didn't really change my opinion about whether there are going to be a lot of video calls. So we started Daily because we thought we could build a terrific technology stack for real-time audio and video that would give kind of any developer the ability to embed audio and video into their apps and websites. It actually took another 4 years or so until the market really did emerge. So we built a bunch of stuff. We tried a bunch of different things. We built some good stuff. We built some stuff that I wouldn't build again. And then we started to get kind of some product market fit. It really felt like developers were like excited about what we were doing in about kind of late 2019, and then the world shut down.
Something happened in 2020 that may have changed the curve of the company.
A few months later, the curve went from, oh, this is interesting, to, oh, this is unbelievable. I didn't sleep through the night for like 6 months. We were just adding servers on AWS, kind of scaling up, reducing bottlenecks as much as possible. So it was really quite a moment for WebRTC. That was both good and not so great, right? Because if you can't control the timing of things, you're just sort of being reactive. And I think personally, one of the real challenges in growing a startup is, trying to find that right balance between being proactive and being reactive. They're all the cliches, right? You have to skate to where the puck is going, but you also have to, build revenue step by step. And, there's a long conversation about that. But we grew a lot during COVID, and some of that revenue was durable and some of it wasn't. And coming out of COVID, I think we had a kind of a really interesting technology stack built, and a really interesting kind of layer of developer tools that lots and lots of developers were using. But I didn't really know where that market was going long term, because COVID had been such a roller coaster. And then GPT-4 came out, and all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, it took a few months to sort of fully, I think, wrap our heads around it. But it became clear relatively quickly that we had built this thing that was accidentally incredibly useful and well suited for a whole new era of use cases. What I called then trying to convince people around us at Daily, basically trying to orient the company to this new world, what I just called the talk to an LLM use cases, very broadly.
I think there's an interesting through line here, if I can try to connect the dots to the beginning of the conversation, where you're talking about the kind of swarms of mini bots you had built for kids. Like, oh, how do all these nodes talk to each other? Well, you really need like a circuit, right? You can't just like use packets. And you sort of like seems like you've made this career-long bet here that WebRTC, which is like the equivalent, not the equivalent of the circuits, the packets, right, is better than like the old school phone system where you're like literally connecting two wires to each other. Am I getting that through line correct here?
Yeah, I mean, my whole career turns out in retrospect to look like, how do you build interesting, useful stuff for real-time communication on top of packet switch networks? Like, that's the whole thing. And I always tell people who come to me for advice about startups, well, do you really want to work on this for 10 years? Like this thing you're telling me about.
For sure.
Yeah.
And that's not actually always the right answer, right? Because I think there are two actually very successful bimodal ends of the distribution about how to build a successful startup. One is you're just very pragmatic, and you kind of iterate with no boundaries on what you personally want to work on until you find the thing that really has, the product market fit where you almost can't fail because of the tailwind. And the other end of the spectrum is, well, there's this one thing you are obsessed with and you can't not work on it. And you're going to work on it for 10 years no matter what. And if you can convince somebody to write you a venture scale check, then the thing you are committing to doing is trying to find the venture scale version of that thing. But no matter what, you're not going to stop working on that thing. and sort of choose which one you want, or don't start a startup, because I've only ever seen those two approaches work.
So when you're thinking about the one thing for daily, you mentioned um, live video and audio, and it is crazy to think that there was a time when people didn't believe that that was going to be ubiquitous. Like I see, I guess I always think about my kids. I see them walking around FaceTiming without even thinking about it. I'm very wary to be on a camera at home, but they don't care. So was it that piece that you felt like you were driven by? Was it the WebRTC piece? Like, was it because as a tech guy, sometimes I get driven by the tech in an unhealthy way, more than kind of like the product that goes hand in hand with it. Which piece of it do you feel like was really catalyzing your drive in those early years?
Well, I'm way, way too prone to be interested in the engineering,
Yeah,
problem
yeah,
that there is to be solved. But I do think the thing I learned over, the course of my career before starting Daily was that's fine as long as you figure out how to get conviction that there are people who will buy this thing if you build it right. Which you never know in advance, right? But at least you should have a very strong process in mind about how you connect these engineering problems you want to solve to something that people will actually buy. And the thing that I, thought a lot about before pulling the trigger and starting Daily was, is there going to be an inflection point where there is just so much live audio and video that there's going to be a massive need for these developer tools? And I really believed there was going to be that inflection point, that it was coming.
yeah. Well, it seems like a great bet. Was there also a time during COVID? I'm particularly curious about this because like Dave and I were running a startup during COVID, and there were so many challenges during that period of time. A lot of them emotional, but one of them was that it was hard to imagine what was happening at that moment not happening someday, if that makes sense. So, in your mind, when you saw that spike of business, were you very cognizant that that might be short-lived, or were you thinking like, this is it, let's go now we're shifting. This is like a new regime, and Daly's going to ride that curve up.
We tried to split the difference, which is maybe an indication that we weren't thinking about it, rigorously enough, because we definitely had people on our cap table, advisors, being like, "Oh, you just need to spend more money to grow faster. Like this is your opportunity. You should be throwing money at growth." And then I also knew in some ways we had product market fit, but in some ways we didn't. And so how do you kind of split the difference there? I think we made some bets that paid off and we made some bets that didn't. Like we invested a lot of engineering in some features that turned out not to create durable revenue. But some of the things we built really did pay off. If I could go back and do it again, I would spend less money on growth and try to be more rigorous about the organic growth stuff that was working for us. I, I we did spend less money than lots of people were pushing us to spend. So, I think hindsight, it's so hard to find the right balance between did you learn the right lessons from hindsight or, without beating yourself up too much. I definitely think, all of us who tried to grow companies during COVID just learned a ton of lessons. And it's still not 100% clear which of those lessons are repeatable lessons and which of them were really specific to that moment in time.
It was yeah, just like so difficult to predict. But it sounds like there was a inflection change for Daily in terms of like massive customer adoption. But it sounds like this is something maybe even more important than that, as the kind of like COVID, full knowledge workplace remoteness started to slowly wane and is still in the process of seemingly slowly waning based on my commute every morning. That The introduction of GPT-4o was more of a big deal, or GPT-4 rather, not 4o, but was more of a big deal than COVID for you guys. I'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, I think it's because, there are periodic big technology transitions. And, the biggest one I've been part of was the internet. But then mobile was also very, very important. So was sort of the growth of the hyperscaler driven cloud, which changed both what you can do as a developer and the economics of a whole bunch of important things. But this new generative AI one feels massive. I think all of us who are kind of inside, at least the bubble I'm in, just feel like this is going to change everything. It's going to change how we write software, how we distribute that software, and how we think about what software can do. And we're trying to kind of speed run, all of us, some combination of all of those changes, early parts of those changes at once. For us at Daily, very specifically, the GPT-4 moment was, oh, there's this thing you can have a conversation with. Well, we are in the business of facilitating conversations. Previously, the bottleneck on adoption of conversations was you had to have two humans or more available at once. Well, this removes that bottleneck. Now you only have to have one human, and maybe not even that, available to have a conversation, to like have the thing we enable happen. We just removed a massive scaling bottleneck for that. I mean, whether we monetize that or not, like, is another, totally other question. Just the world just removed this scaling bottleneck. And in fact, you might not even need to have one human available, although I'm human, so I'm biased towards thinking that having a human in the conversation is interesting. But we see in our logs now a customer of ours placing an outbound phone call and another customer of ours answering that outbound phone call. And what's on both of those phone calls is an LLM.
Yeah,
So,
that's wild.
that's a very, very interesting technology transition moment to be starting to see snap into focus. And we should just talk a little bit about the tooling for that, because the sort of the last piece of this of this sort of journey so far is we started building on top of GPT-4 kind of LLM powered capabilities, like inside or alongside our WebRTC tech stack, things like meeting copilots that would do live transcription and then also give you like action items as you were going. Things now we are sort of all starting to use at scale. And those kind of morphed into, well, how can we make this stuff even more real time? Well, we can give these LLMs a voice, because there's decent speech generation technology, and some of it can actually run in real time. We can do the transcription in real time. We can actually have a conversation with these LLMs just with our voice. That's super interesting. To do that, you have to solve a bunch of low level problems of the kind that I'm always, sort of engineering motivated to solve. Things like, very low latency interruption handling. So if the human interrupts when the LLM is talking, like that works like the human expects. Things like figuring out when the human is done talking so the LLM can respond. There's lots of low latency data pipelining to make everything work from the network layer all the way up through the inference layer, talking to the LLMs, however you do with APIs or with GPUs, GPU frameworks running locally. So we solved a bunch of these problems because we were interested in this problem space. And then we started seeing other people start to build these kind of things, and they were trying to solve the same problems over again. Well, that's a great opportunity in a brand new ecosystem to just release stuff as open source and see what happens, because everything is so new. Like, what's the shape of all this stuff going to be? Nobody knows. But if you've built some good stuff, why not open source it and help people, figure it out with you faster? So we open sourced all the stuff we'd built for the talk to LLM use cases. And that sort of puttered along and puttered along and puttered along for a few months, and then all of a sudden a bunch of people discovered it, and that open source project hit its own inflection point. So that project is called PipeCat. It's now by far the most widely used voice agent framework. This is a new way for me to talk about PipeCat. Like a year ago, I talked about PipeCat as like an orchestration layer for multimodal real-time AI, which, works for a slice of the audience, but it works for a lot more people in 2025 to say PipeCat, the most widely used voice agent framework. But I think you get kind of what we're going for there. So PipeCat is now used by NVIDIA and Google DeepMind and OpenAI and lots and lots and lots and lots of startups. And that's been a really exciting thing to kind of switch gears to this new set of use cases, but also to spending a lot of our time at Daily building out a framework and a community that's truly open source, truly vendor neutral, at the early stage of this transition where everybody's very collaboratively trying to figure this stuff out. I mean, more people use PipeCat with Twilio than with Daily today, because Twilio has such a great set of developer tools around telephony. And 95% of or more of the revenue from voice AI today is either making or receiving phone calls. So it's actually been a lot of fun as an engineer to be part of this kind of really fast growing, completely vendor neutral open source community too. and to be able to work on it as part of what we work on professionally.
I love PipeCat. I love the shirt, which I assume is a PipeCat shirt. And Dave and
Yeah.
I are actually employing it in a project that we're building right now. Solves so many problems for us. I'd love to pick it apart a little bit. When you talk about, kind of like PipeCat as a voice agent framework, what are the sorts of problems it's solving kind of like in that pipeline of building an agent? And let's say, forgetting about which vendors you're using, what are sort of the abstract problems of talking to an LLM and having the LLM respond to you over voice that the framework solves for a developer?
There's sort of three big, very high level things that you are either going to have to write your own code to do or use a framework like PipeCat. And one of them is make everything work at very low latency. Um, Doing anything at very low latency is something only a small slice of engineers have historically ever worried about. It turns out that that is a hard requirement for conversational voice because humans expect a response in under a second if they're talking to a voice agent, and if the response times are long, you're in that uncanny valley where people start to get uncomfortable and people hang up on a phone call or whatever. So just making sure that everything from the network transit up all the way through how fast each of the generative AI components you're using are able to happen in streaming mode at very low latency is like critical. The second thing is, how do you get these brand new generative AI components to be reliable? And that has a bunch of different pieces of reliability. We're so early in all of this new tooling that nothing is as reliable as like the web-based tooling we've spent 25 years figuring out and optimizing. And then at the very top of that stack, there's the open question of how do you even prompt these new things effectively? So if you've got like an enterprise workflow you really care about, like healthcare patient intake, where you're calling a patient before a healthcare appointment and you really need to get 5 questions answered, how do you do that? There's some combination of prompting and non-generative AI logic and guardrails and evals that happen in real time and evals that happen offline so you know if stuff was reliable. So there's like a whole bundle of stuff that you need something to help you with that full stack. And then the third thing is all of these tools are evolving so quickly that most people building this stuff want to be able to swap out different LLMs, different transcription models, different voice generation models, different content management guardrail models, maybe different evals frameworks. So if you have an abstraction layer that lets you write code that works similarly enough for lots of different pieces of the ecosystem, that's a real win. So PipeCat supports, I think, like more than 40 of the generative AI services that people are using in production for voice agents. So those three things are kind of the big motivating things for PipeCat, and then all of them have very specific long lists of things you're trying to do when you actually write the core code.
Got it. I mean, one of the things that we've been really impressed by when you look at, the PipeCat, at least like documentation example code in the community, is there's sort of a very clear, opinionated approach about like how you construct a pipeline, what are the different components that go into it. Um, and it does also make it really easy to switch between providers. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that because one of the things that I still find kind of jarring about how we program now with LLMs is that we're basically interfacing with these huge closed foundational models, and you just kind of have to treat them like black boxes. There's model drift, so things will change over time. You don't know what the protocol necessarily is for interfacing with each of them, although it seems like there's sort of a de facto standard that's developing. Yeah, how do you build an open source framework around these closed systems?
We are figuring out new ways of programming with these things, like as a community, and they're so non-deterministic that sometimes things that you think are going to be very hard, they're actually just out of the box really good at. And then some things you think are going to be easy are just a struggle to
Getting an
get them to
ID
do
correct seems to be a struggle.
100%.
Yeah,
And then there's some things in the middle where if you've learned a certain grab bag of prompting techniques, you're like, oh, okay, I think I know how to do that, and then you do it and you test it and maybe you iterate a couple times and it works. So it definitely is a whole new set of like programming patterns that I think we're learning. Um, at the high level, I think there's a lot of convergence in agent frameworks, not just real time, but non real time agent frameworks around a couple of abstractions that I think are actually the same thing under the covers. Some people are like converging on like multi agent abstractions, meaning you have a bunch of different like collections of prompts and tools and whatever else you sort of bundle together into the idea of an agent that handles different parts of an important workflow. And the other abstraction, which again I think is actually pretty much the same thing, just a slightly different view into it, is a state machine. So there's a library that's starting to get a lot of adoption built on top of PipeCat called PipeCat Flows, which is a really nice state machine abstraction for doing complicated workflows that try to have your cake and eat it too, where the LLM is so good at open-ended conversation, and that's what's opened up all these new use cases. But you also need some things to happen in the business logic of an enterprise workflow. So you're trying to get both of those things. You're trying to harness the open-ended conversational capabilities, but also make sure that the LM actually does certain things that you need it to do. And so PipeCat Flows is a state machine abstraction where each kind of node in a conversation is a bundle of a system instruction, some kind of transformation of the context during that call so far. So you might summarize the context so you're focused on certain things, or you get the context down to a size where like things like function calling are reliable for that particular LLM. A tools list or a set of functions that you are going to call to like interact with your backend systems, and then a set of exit criteria to go to other nodes in the flow. And but it turns out that bundling those things together, where each node you can kind of replace or modify the system instruction, the context, the tools list, and the exit functions, gives you this kind of handle to making complex workflows like massively more reliable. I think you were talking to Tom in the last podcast here about the idea that demos are now pretty easy with these really great generative AI tools, but production is still really, really hard in a lot of domains. And things like PipeCat Flows are trying to bridge that gap. And it's not the only tool you need, but it just turned out to be kind of really good leverage for bridging that gap between the demo and the, oh, this works for 98% of calls, not 40% of calls if you deploy it in production. The other thing I think is interesting about the PipeCat architecture, just to me personally, is we've got all of this experience on our team at Daily building these real-time processing pipelines. So like engineers on our team have contributed over the years a lot to things like GStreamer, which is a really cool but also really like a sharp learning curve media processing framework written in C. That's like the workhorse for the under the covers of a lot of like media processing stuff out in the world. So we were very, very influenced by that idea that you have a bunch of heterogeneous data. You need to be able to build programmatic elements that know how to process, subsets of that heterogeneous data. You can build kind of a processing pipeline or a processing graph, and there's certain ways you need to write that framework so that everything happens as fast as it possibly can, because latency is so important. So PipeCat is very much that pipeline model influenced by, years and years of working on things like GStreamer.
That it makes a lot of sense. That's exactly how the code is laid out when you start a new PipeCat agent. So you mentioned that, like as new tools come online, one of the goals for PipeCat is to be able to allow developers to sort of like seamlessly adopt those new tools. How do you view something like OpenAI real time or, similar sorts of models changing the voice AI stack, and how is that influencing PipeCat's roadmap?
I love all the new stuff because like it pushes on, did you get the architecture right? And hopefully the answer is partly yes, but the answer is always partly no, right? When there's something new. Um, what we're seeing commercially for the speech-to-speech models, so the two most advanced ones are the OpenAI GPT-4 audio preview, which is kind of both available through the real-time API in some form and through the HTTP APIs, and then the Gemini 2.0 Flash model, which is also multimodal and available through Google's multimodal live API. Those are clearly the future. Like having the LLM understand audio input and be able to generate audio output is a real STEM function in things like emotional valence of both understanding and output. Really, really, really cool. Um, Neither of those models are quite there yet for a lot of the enterprise use cases that are driving a bunch of PipeCat adoption kind of at scale. Um, it turns out that at the moment, and I think this is very much just a moment in time, having to process the audio for a whole bunch of underlying technical reasons in the models is causes a reduction in other things you really, really need for these enterprise workflows, like instruction following reliability and function calling reliability. So we are still seeing basically all the commercial use cases still use three separate models: transcription, LLM, speech generation. That will clearly not be true forever. So what we're trying to do is evolve the architecture of these agentic components so that they support both really well, and developers can experiment, migrate, use the cascaded model pipeline for parts of their workflow, use the speech to speech models for parts of their workflow, maybe even break up the speech to speech models so that they're used in the pieces where they make sense. Even like you can use the OpenAI real-time API just as transcription. You can use the Gemini API just as transcription. So is that sort of a bridge to this future? Mostly that's experimentation at this point. It's also been super fun to work with the teams at those big labs building these APIs and be able to ask them, hey, like, if we gave you some data about like where function calling is falling down, would you, maybe use it in training the next version of the model? Because that feels like we're able, with all of the commercial use cases we see, sometimes to give like really good feedback that maybe is able to influence like the trajectory of those tools.
That's super interesting. Um, yeah, maybe this is like a nice segue into zooming out a little bit into voice AI trends. We just talked about how live video and audio, people didn't see it coming, right? And I definitely feel the same thing is happening with voice AI, where I see it coming, and in certain use cases, it's already saturating at some level, maybe call centers or certain segments of the industry. But then when I talk to people in my life, pretty much no one has interacted with voice AI yet. So what kind of patterns are you seeing, given that you do see so much of the creation of these tools in voice AI adoption? Who's adopting it? Where is it kind of like penetrating earliest? Where do you see that going?
Almost all the adoption at scale right now is in enterprise workflows around telephony, or customer service that has a telephony component and an app component. So people are replacing the big pieces of the call center tech stack. In 2 years, the call center tech stack is going to be entirely different. The leverage of putting an LLM into that call center tech stack in a big way is just so big. And if you're in that world, it's like an interesting moment of transition. Like, are the existing players going to survive that transition, or is there going to be a whole new set of tools? Can people who've played adjacent to like the call center in the customer, kind of communication segment, like HubSpot and Twilio, can they cannibalize a bunch of the call center? Like, there's a bunch of interesting business questions there. Um, I think the consumer stuff hasn't come along as fast as the enterprise stuff, because there's been a slightly unusual moment where the enterprise ROI is just so clear, that that's front running the consumer use cases. My hot take is that we all are going to take for granted talking to LLMs with our voice at some point in the future, way more than even the most optimistic of us think, because it's one of those see around the corner things. Like, you just can't quite imagine it. It's a little like when the iPhone came out. Can you quite imagine the sort of social, local, mobile stuff that happened 3, 4 years later? Like, basically nobody could. We had to sort of build it and experiment. But the little glimmers of it are like, one of the things that convinced me of the talk to an LLM opportunity was a few months after GPT-4 came out and we started publishing these open source libraries. I just saw huge numbers of individual young developers in San Francisco building themselves personal coaches and, therapists and assistants.
Yep.
And that early adopter, like, oh, I'm just going to build it for myself thing resonated so powerfully with people who were like, had access to these tools. But I think we're all going to have friends in our group chats that aren't human because LLMs are actually really entertaining when you prompt them right, and they're getting better. And they also have utility around things like remembering stuff and being able to look up stuff for you. So, like, I'm in a bunch of group chats, and those group chats are all going to have LLMs in them. There's no question about it. And I think one step beyond that, like we all have parasocial relationships with celebrities, like every single one of us in the world today. Some of our celebrities are niche celebrities. Some of our celebrities we follow are like massive, big market celebrities. I don't know how long it's going to take, but like we're going to have those parasocial relationships with non-human celebrities. It's just very, very clear. I think the consumer inflection point might actually happen for video before it happens for voice
That's
because we
interesting.
are video creatures. I mean, you see the evolution of of all technology stacks as like text to images to audio to video, but adoption rates are sometimes funny and spiky, and there's so much progress in real time video generation. I think it's possible. It's dangerous to predict all this stuff, right? But I think it's possible that 2025 will see that inflection point in real time video, and that will be what drives consumer adoption of some of these real-time conversational stacks.
So when our kids are walking around the house FaceTiming, they're going to be FaceTiming with an LLM that has a avatar of some kind
Yeah, exactly. And often that'll be like a human friend and an LLM friend in one
in the
conversation.
chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be an awesome world, weird world we have ahead of us. I'm looking forward to the voice coding tools. I just want to be able to like get some PRs ready for me while I'm on a walk, you know? Um, I spent yesterday afternoon, I spent an hour with my daughter who's 9 doing Claude Code to make a game from scratch, right, in JavaScript. And it was so fun. And her instincts on like what to prompt the thing for were actually really amazing. You know, we built like a side scroller, basically like a platformer. Um, you know, pretty much right away, we started playing and she's like, well, hey, how do I share this with my friends? I want to put this in my chat or iMessage chat with her friends. And then B, none of my friends have a computer, so this whole thing with the arrow keys, that's not going to work. Like it's going to have to be mobile friendly from the get go. That was like her second prompt. I was like, well, how am I going to play this on my iPad? I was like, oh, you're a genius. Like that would have been so late in my like list of like things. Like, oh, I guess at the end we'll make it like responsive and like mobile friendly or whatever. She's like, no, like before I can share it with my friends, it has to be. You know? And that kind of like looking around the corner thing. I'm just so curious when as folks get more access to this. Like, yeah, to your point, I really don't think we're going to be able to imagine the creativity that will be unlocked when people get these tools and can interact with them in ways that aren't about like I love tweaking a config file and like making sure that my shell setup is right, but most people don't, and that prevents them from like experiencing the joy of like creation with computers. And I think we're just really close to a place where that won't be true, which sounds like an awesome feature to me.
It really does. I mean, vibe coding it's here to stay, and it's just a question of how it evolves. I wonder if there are some parallels to like early GUI computing, like desktop publishing became a thing because the Mac gave graphical computing with kind of the right handles, the right shaped handles to a mass market. It sort of feels like vibe coding is a similar thing. Like a lot of people will use it for fun, but it will also create a new way we all do things professionally.
I'm excited about it. I also racked up surprisingly high Anthropic bill making that game, but it was worth it. Nothing crazy, but I was like, oh, that was fun. But I can see a reason why everybody's not doing this yet.
One of the ways I've tried to live in the future with mixed success is all of the coding tools, some of them which are really, really good, Cursor, Windsurf, Claude Code, they're not multimodal. You can, I've done some wiring up to talk to all of them, which is good, but also tried to run and sometimes write my own little coding agents where I'm just always sharing my screen. And that actually feels transformative. And I'm really looking forward to screen visibility being built into all these tools because I've found that when I'm running these like hacked up, very bad versions of these agents that I wrote myself, I can do things like say, oh man, that stack trace is weird. And because the LLM can see my terminal, it's like, oh, well, you just didn't do the pip install. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. I would have figured that out But it might have taken me 30 seconds to look back through the stack trace and figure it out. And
And who wants to spend that 30 seconds? I want it now. My daughter was really pissed that the quad code turns could sometimes take like, 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes. I'm like, this thing is running a game from scratch. I have not even opened my editor at all. And you're like, it's like a fox collecting mice. Make the fox look cooler. It's like, okay, it did, And now I'm going to be like, make it happen in 1 second and look at my screen and do it,
I would love to see a video of your workflow for that, because I've been meaning to do that with my 10-year-old and just haven't done it yet. I'm curious, like, were you using Claude Code in the terminal?
Just in the terminal, yeah. We just had the terminal up, and I was kind of like piloting the keyboard, and we would just kind of talk. And I was like, what should we tell it to do for the next like turn? And it would go. It takes a while. She loved the, it spits out like a kind of funny word as it's like generating the code. And then we'd open up the browser window and refresh the page and see what happened. It was like she found it very satisfying. And we did get 2 adopters of the game in her group chat. So I feel like, it's a start. That's infinite growth on a day over day basis. So
Is she raising money?
Why see here we come? Yeah.
Fantastic. It's so great.
It's fun. And I'll send a link. Yeah, I highly recommend it as a activity with the kids, because like it truly gives them access to stuff that like, a lot of my childhood was spent in my basement with the BBS and like weird books that my parents got for me to learn how to code. And that's just not, well, we don't have a basement, but other than that, like that's also just not what kids are doing these days. They have an iPad, and they're also like go outside, hopefully occasionally. And like, I think this could be something really special to bring that joy out there, which would be amazing. What's next for Daily, for you and for Daily?
Well, we just yesterday released an agent hosting platform built on top of PipeCat called PipeCat Cloud.
Awesome.
We got a lot of requests
Congrats.
in the Discord for like, once you write these bits of Python code, how do you deploy them and scale them? And we actually resisted building that for a while because we didn't want to dilute the kind of focus on the core PipeCat. But as the questions in Discord piled up, we realized that we had a lot of experience with infrastructure that was useful here, going, one small layer up the stack to solve another set of problems for people. So I'm excited about PipeCat Cloud because, I'm excited about everything that makes it easier for people to build these kinds of new agents and experiment with them.
Well, Quinn, thanks so much for coming on the show. Where can folks find you on the internet if they want to learn more about Daily and PipeCat and PipeCat Cloud?
I spend a lot of time on Twitter talking about real-time AI with people, so I'm at Kwindla on Twitter. And you can also find us at daily.co, and PipeCat is pipecat.ai.
Awesome.
Quinn, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. It's been great.